The shaker peg shelf has a couple different components. First is the shelf board, and then we have the wall plate. We've got 2 brackets. We've got 3 shaker pegs, which are purchased parts. We don't need to make those. And then we've got 2 chair buttons. Again, those are purchased parts. We don't need to make those. The shelf is 34 inches long by 5.5 inches wide. We're going to make the project out of eastern white pine. So this is the first time we're going to be using a coniferous tree, and it's softwood. To make our project, we're going to use eastern white pine. So this is a softwood, a coniferous tree or evergreen. We're going to make our project using eastern white pine. So pine is an evergreen or a coniferous tree. It's much softer than hardwoods. I can take my thumbnail and I can push my thumbnail in and I can dent this wood, so it's soft. We have to be careful of that. It sands really nice and cuts easy because it's soft. We're going to make the project out of eastern white pine. So if you're walking through a forest and you see some pine trees, how do you know if it's a white pine tree? Well, if you look at the needles are in clumps of 5. And if we look at the word white, W-H-I-T-E. So there's 5 letters in the name white. The word white. We're going to make our project out of eastern white pine. And if you're walking we're going to make our project out of eastern white pine. So we know that it is found on the East Coast and it's also found in the Midwest. It's a white pine tree, and if you're walking through the forest and you see a pine tree with needles in clumps of 5, you know that it's a white pine because the word white, W-H-I-T-E, has 5 letters in it, and the needles will be in clumps of 5. So a pine tree is an evergreen tree or a coniferous tree. It's very soft compared to the other woods we've been using. If I take my thumb, I can push down on my thumbnail and I can actually dent the wood. So we have to be a little more careful when we're handling our project because it dents easy. It sands really nice and cuts nice because it's soft, and when you're cutting it gives off a nice aroma. Now we're going to make our project out of a 1x6 board. So this is a 1x6 S4S. So softwood is sold differently than hardwood. Hardwood we're purchasing random lengths and random widths with S2S, meaning 2 edges were not surfaced. So here we have all 4, or both faces and 2 edges are nice and straight, flat, and smooth. We're going to make our project using eastern white pine. So this is our first time using pine, which is a evergreen tree or a coniferous tree. If you're walking through the forest and you see a pine tree with 5 needles in a clump, that's a white pine. How do we remember that? Because white, W-H-I-T-E, has 5 letters in the word, And again, the needles will be in bunches of 5. So it's a soft wood. I can take my thumbnail and I can actually push down on the board and I can dent the board. So we have to be a little bit more careful when we're handling and storing the board. It sands and cuts really nice. When you cut it, there's definitely a fragrance or aroma that it gives off that's quite pleasant. We're going to be using boards that look like this. These are 1x6 boards, S4S. So a 1x6 S4S means that they surfaced the top and the bottom. The 2 edges are surfaced. For our project, we're going to use Eastern white pine. This is the first time that we've used a pine board. Pine is sometimes referred to as evergreen or coniferous, and this is the Eastern white pine. So if you're walking through a forest and you see some pine needles in bunches of 5, in groups of 5, you'll be looking at an Eastern white pine. So long needles in bunches of 5. If we look at the word white, W-H-I-T-E, there's 5 letters in the word white, and so if you see the 5 needles bunched together, you know you have a white pine. We're going to use 1x6 S4S boards. S4S means they surfaced 4 different sides. So the top is nice and flat and smooth, the bottom's nice and flat and smooth, and the 2 edges are nice and flat and smooth. Now, the nominal size is a 1x6. So meaning when you go to the store, the label on the product will say it's a 1x6. But you can see here, a 1x6 doesn't really measure 1 inch by 6 inches. It measures 5.5 by 3/4 of an inch. Well, why is that? When they first milled this at the sawmill, they did make it 1 inch by 6 inches. And then what they did is they performed more operations on it. They planed it down more, they smoothed it out, they jointed the edges. So a board that started off as 1x6, by the time it gets to the consumer, is really 5.5 by 3/4. So the term 1x6 refers to the nominal size, and its actual size is 3/4 of an inch by 5.5. So we know that the finished length of the shelf board is going to be 34 inches. So our first step is to rough to length. So I'm going to grab my tape measure, and I don't want to mark 34 inches. I always want to go a little bit extra when I'm roughing to length. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mark at 35. Before I do that though, keep in mind I'm not measuring across at a diagonal. I'm measuring with the edge of the tape measure parallel to the edge of the board, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a mark at 35. That's all I need for now, is just that mark, and I can take this over to the miter saw and I can cut right on top of that mark, because what we're doing at this point is just roughing to length. Step 2 is to rip to width. We want the width to be 5 3/8. We're going to come over, we're going to use the table saw, and notice that this board is wide enough where I'm not going to use a push stick now. I feel like I have better control without the push stick, and it's wide enough to keep my fingers safely away from the blade. Step 3 is to square both ends. So I just want to take a little sliver cut off the end of each board. Step 4 is called finish to length. Our finished length is going to be 34 inches. So I take my tape measure. Again, I've got the tape measure parallel to the edge and not diagonal. I go ahead and I put a little mark at 34. Now I'm going to take my speed square and I hook the speed square on. When I say hooked on, right, it's hooked on. And then what I can do is I can just slide this along. I slide it along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop when I hit that spot right there. So now I've got my mark is lined up with the edge of my speed square. And what I can do is I can trace that line. When I trace the line, what I do is I put a check mark on the side of the line. Because we know if we were to go over and cut this on the miter saw right now, if we put the saw blade directly on the line, you're going to take away the line. And I know the line is at 34 inches from the other end. So if we take away the line, our board's going to be a little bit short. So when I go to the miter saw, what I want to do is I want to put the saw blade next to the line, and that's where the check mark helps me remember to do that. So here we are at the miter saw, ready to finish to length. Keep in mind, what we want to do is we want to align the blade so the blade is next to the line and not on top of the line. When finished, we should just barely see a little bit of our line left in our mark. This project is going to be screwed together. So in order to use screws, we need to drill some holes for the screws. The first hole that I want to lay out is halfway centered on this board. So don't forget the board was 34 inches long, so half of 34 is 17. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a mark at 17. Then I grab my speed square and I slide my speed square up until I line up with that mark. And I go ahead and I trace a little line. We're going to do the same thing 4.5 inches in from both ends. So we're going to have holes on this line, and that line. Now, in the back here, this is going to be my back edge. This gets screwed down into the wall plate. We know that the wall plate is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick because we're going to use 1x6 lumber. Half of 3/4 is 3/8 of an inch. So what we need to do we're going to have holes here, here, and here. We're going to have a hole along the back edge here and here. We're going to have holes along this line, one at this line, and some down at this edge. Now, along this back edge here, we're going to screw down into the wall plate. We know that the wall plate's made of 1x6, so we know that the thickness of the wall plate is 3/4 of an inch. So half of 3/4 of an inch is 3/8 of an inch. So we want to position our holes, lay out our holes, so they're 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. So the easiest thing to do is use your combination square, set this distance right here to 3/8 of an inch, because it's dimension we're going to need to repeat. And what I do is I hook it on. I'm holding it up against the edge, and what I do is I just go ahead and trace the end of my ruler. And so what we've got is pretty much X marks the spot. I know the hole is going to go right there in the center. We also have on the ends a couple more holes. Here we're going to come in 1 3/4 inches, and then we're going to come in 3.5 inches. So again, on the end here we got 1, 2, 3 holes. I know exactly where they're supposed to be. I've got X marks the spot here. I've got 1 hole here, and again down at this end 1 3/4 and 3.5. Now what I want to do is I want to take my awl and I put that right on the center, right X marks the spot, and I just go ahead and I give that a little hit, put a little dimple there, and I'm going to repeat that for all 7 holes. Step 6 is to go ahead and drill what we call the plug holes. We're going to use the drill press. We're going to use a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. We've got our layout already marked. These holes do not go down all the way through the board. They just go down a little ways. So on the head of the drill bit, what we want to do is we want to go down until this portion of the drill bit is just flush or sticking above the surface of the board a little bit. You can see the result. We only went down a little ways. We'll do that for the remaining 6 holes. Now that the plug holes are drilled, what we need to do now is drill another hole right there all the way down through, a through hole. That's going to be a clearance hole for the screws. So anytime you're drilling through, what we should do is we should put a support board underneath it so that we avoid tear out on the underside. We're going to use a hand drill with a 3/16 twist drill at the end. There's already a dimple down in the bottom of the hole. So now what we have is we have 2 holes. We have a clearance hole. That's where the screw is just going to go ahead and drop down through. And then we have another hole up here where we're going to go ahead and we're going to plug. After we screw this together, we're going to put a plug in here to cover up that screw. You can see we have a nice routered edge on the bottom edge, the bottom front edge of the shelf board. It's on the 2 ends also. It's not, however, on the back edge. So what we want to do is we want to router the front edge and the 2 ends. So let's head to the router table. At the router table, the router table should be all set up with the OG bit, keeping in mind we want the routered edge to be on the bottom of the board. So when we're routering, we want to see these holes, the big holes, facing up. What we're going to do is we're always going to router the end first. What happens when I router the end of this board, when I get done routering at this point right here, there's no support for those wood fibers and they're going to want to tear out. So we want to avoid tear out by doing the ends first. And what we do is we put a support stick right here to hold those wood fibers in place when we're routering. So we router one end, we rotate the board around 180 degrees, being careful that we don't flip it over. We want to see those big holes. Again, put our support stick on, router the other end, and then we can router the edge. We're ready to router 3 edges of the board. Keeping in mind the routered edge, we want the routered edge to be on the bottom of the board. So we're going to router with the top up. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to see those big holes. We also want to keep in mind we're only going to router the front edge and the 2 ends. So let's go ahead and put a note here or a symbol to remind us that we're not going to router this edge. Anytime we're routering, we're going to router the end grain first. What's going to happen if we router the end grain first, we come along, we're routering, and we get to this point right here, there's nothing supporting those wood fibers, and when I finish the cut, those wood fibers are going to want to tear out on us. So when we're doing our end grain, we're always going to use what we call a support stick. So I have the support stick here, I run this across, and right now the support stick is holding those wood fibers in place, and we go ahead and we router the sacrificial support stick. Rotate this thing around, do the other end. Go ahead, router that, and then finally we're going to do the front edge. You don't need a support stick this time, and we just go ahead and push this board through and router the front edge. Don't forget, we're only doing 3 edges. You've got a lot of work into this board, so we want to make sure it doesn't get lost, misplaced, or stolen. So what we want to do is on this back edge, this is the edge that eventually is going to go up against the wall and nobody's going to see it. I need you to put your name and period here. Your name. I don't want initials. I want a first and last name and a period here. And now we're ready to go ahead and we can do some sanding. You're going to find that this is softwood. It's going to sand much quicker and faster than our other projects with hardwood. We're going to still start off with 80 grit. Make sure that you go with the grain, keeping the sander flat on the surface. Don't tip it up or roll this because it'll put a dent or divot or furrow in your board pretty quickly. So what we want to do is we want to do what I call the top surface, the bottom surface. I would quickly do the front edge, all right, but be careful. Again, we want to keep this flat. We don't want to roll it to either side, otherwise we'll almost be like making a pass with the router. Okay, so we can 80 grit the top, the bottom, the front edge, and the 2 ends. And then we'll move on to medium, 120 grit. And again, do all those surfaces. You're going to find that it's going to go much faster than our other projects. After we rough in medium sand, the board feels really smooth. But what happened, especially with softwood, is we've taken all the wood fibers and we've smushed them down into the board. We've compressed them down into the board. And we know that this board is kind of like a sponge. And what happens when the board gets wet again, what's going to happen is it's going to puff up or plump up. And all these little wood fibers that we've smushed down into the board, again, when it gets wet, they puff back up again, and it's not going to feel as smooth. It's going to feel a little furry. So you want to say, well, why is this board going to get wet? This project, we're going to go ahead and we're going to apply a finish to it. So any kind of finish we put on comes in some kind of liquid form. And so what happened, this board is going to receive some liquid somehow, and so what's going to happen is it's going to plump up, puff up, and kind of get furry. So to avoid this, what we want to do is we want to do something called raise the grain. We're going to take a wet paper towel, I mean it's really wet, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to rub this whole entire board, and we're going to get it damp. We're going to do the top, we'll do the bottom, we'll do the edges, we'll do the end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to let this dry. And then what we can do after it's dry, now we'll sand with 220, and we're going to sand away that little furriness, and so that the next time that liquid is applied, there won't be any little fibers to pop back up again. So this step is called raising the grain. You're going to go ahead, you're going to let it dry. After it's completely dry, we're going to go ahead and use a 220 grit sanding. Won't take long at all to get this thing really smooth.